Good evening and welcome everyone. On the eve of Remembrance Day, what a better way to celebrate that momentous day by releasing a book that covers both World War I and World War II, Christopher Canniff's Intervals of Hope. We'll get started right away. I think we have some people joining the feed just now. So let me introduce ourselves. I'm Shane Joseph. I'm the publisher of Blue Denim Press. It is my privilege to have worked and published this book, Intervals of Hope by Christopher Canniff. Just some logistics. We're going to have an interview with Christopher. He's going to do some readings. We're going to take some questions, both from the audience and from myself. And then we'll tell you where this book can be purchased. And then hopefully this will be an interactive session between the audience and Christopher. If you have any questions, please put them in the Facebook feed in the comments section, and I'll be happy to relay those to Christopher, and we'll try to answer them in this session. So again, welcome, and let's get started. So I'd like to introduce you to Christopher. Christopher Canniff is the author of Poor Man's Galapagos, also published by Blue Denim Press in 2015, and Abundance of the Infinite by Quattro Books in 2012. Christopher has been mentored by two of Canada's top writers, M.G. Wasanji and David Adams Richards, at the Humber School for Writers. Christopher is a past president of the Canadian Authors Association Toronto branch. His short stories have been published in Descan magazine and in a Tightrope Books anthology. He was shortlisted in the 2012 Ken Klonsky Novella Contest with Quattro Books and in the 2010 Matrix Lit Pop Awards for Fiction. He won LWOT magazine's 3R Novel Contest in 2007. Christopher lived in Ecuador, where he read over 50 books of world literature and learned a new language and culture, and taught English at an Ecuadorian university for World Teach, a non-profit and non-governmental organization based at the Harvard Institute of International Development. Christopher obtained a mechanical engineering degree in 1995 from the University of Toronto, and is a registered professional engineer in the province of Ontario. He's married to the love of his life, Roxanne, and has two amazing children, Colin and Abigail. And with that, welcome, Christopher.
Yeah, thank you very much, Shane. Very glad to be here. Thanks.
So, Christopher, I have some questions for you, obviously, and hopefully the audience will have some questions for you too. Let's start. You say that this book was inspired by the letters of your great-grandfather who fought in World War I. Were they in any particular order to be assembled into a story, or did you have to invent a lot of things to get it going?
Yeah, so just to start, there are 85 letters that were sent home during World War I by my great-grandfather, Wilfred Littlejohn. And those letters were recently discovered in a family attic. And Wilfred was in the 1st Battalion, 1st Brigade, and was one of the first Canadians to be sent overseas and among the last to return. So he was one of 70 out of 1,000 men in his regiment to have survived. So these letters were addressed to his parents and to his brother and his aunt. And they were written from trenches when he had downtime, from the hospitals when he was wounded and recovering in the hospital, and from camps where he was going through training. So some sections of the letters were scribbled over by censors. So the censors would review for any secret information, including like any upcoming battles or the number of troops in specific locations. And so I had to surmise what might be in those sections. And when I received the letters, they were digitized and arranged chronologically. So I went through, transcribed them, read through them. And I was just looking to see what to include in the novel. So what I did was looked at what the influence on the main character might be at that specific point in his life, where he was going through and reviewing these letters, knowing what was happening in the country, looking at what his father had written. So for the novel, some parts of the letters were deleted, abbreviated, others revised, but for the most part, they're intact. And I combined letters as well. And I had to create one letter, and that was a brief letter, but written in the same style and voice as the others. So.
Good. Now you paint a very wide canvas in this novel. World War One, World War Two, the collieries in the UK between the wars, and the farms in rural Ontario, in order to record events that took place in this novel. And most of these events took place before you were born. So what kind of research did you do other than the letters from your great-grandfather?
Okay. So the novel starts in London, England between the wars. So that's where I started with my research. So I read books like, I've got some of them here. One of them was The History of London, which is very long and dry. And I really recommend it for insomniacs. The next one is In the News. So it's just kind of a news story book, which had a collection of articles like Fascism Explained. So come to the public meeting at Birmingham and find out what fascism is all about. So things like that. So interesting for research, as well as the 1930s scrapbook. So again, like what's in your pantry, what's kind of on your bookshelf, what's in various parts of your home, and what things you might commonly see. I also read through George Orwell's The Road to Wigan Pier, about life in the coal mines of South Leeds. And another one was Inside Europe by John Gunther. So I've got that here. And this is a very rare book that is from October 1938. So what it showed was right before World War II is when this book came out. And this kind of shows a snapshot of what Europe was like at that time. And it doesn't give you the skewed historical lens that, some historical books that are published now might have. So that was kind of the reading aspect, but then I wanted to get some details right. So I contacted George Sharp, who lived in London between the wars, and he was living in New Zealand at the time. And I was able to read his story online and ask him questions about his life back then. And he was a police officer, so he had a bit of a different perspective, but he was still very willing to share and very open, gave me a lot of good input, clarifications on details and things like that. And then I also read about Gordon Shotlander in the Burlington Post. So I was living in Burlington at the time, and saw Gordon's story, and you can see that there's his father's medals there, as well as his father's diary from World War I, and an inset picture of his father, and Gordon's in the center there. So I contacted Gordon, and he graciously agreed to be interviewed for the book. So we had many wonderful conversations that I'll always remember. And Gordon's not only he's a veteran who was trained as a British commando and a commissioned officer, but amazing, very humble man. And it's been a real blessing to know him. So a lot of his story comes through in the book. So I also traveled to London, England many times and went around the city as the main character would have. So visiting most of the places that he frequented in the book. So
very good. That's a lot of research. In fact, a lot of readers, many readers don't quite understand sometimes how much research goes into even a work of fiction, and how much of that research is subsequently used. Perhaps a very small fraction of it, but there still needs to be the research done into the book. But in your case, I think reading the book, there is a lot of the research that is in that book, which makes it quite authentic. Now, a recurrent theme in your work is the father-son conflict, as viewed from the son's point of view. You explored this in your last novel, Poor Man's Galapagos, and now you're doing the same in this book. Why is this so important? And has it a bearing in your own life?
Yeah. So I understand how important the father-son relationship is, especially to a young man who's developing in his understanding of the world. And myself, I've had very little conflict with my own father, who's always been very supportive. And my son, Colin, he's a gem. But I understand how consuming that relationship can be for a child or a young man if that father-son bond is broken. So that's what I was interested in exploring in these two novels. But in the beginning of Intervals of Hope, the main character, Nicholas, has an absent father who lives hours away in the mines of South Leeds. And Nicholas is driven to reunite the family. So that provides the conflict that really drives him in that novel. In Poor Man's Galapagos, that was originally conceived as a single novel, which included Intervals of Hope. And in a sense, it's like a sequel. That in that one, the main character, Tomas, is searching for answers about the sudden disappearance of his father from a remote South American island and his mother's decision to abandon Tomas at birth. So he's searching for answers about that as well. So in both novels, the father-son conflict works to develop the main characters as they're struggling for reconciliation. So it really helps define them as they mature. And it's about an internal drive that these main characters have. In the case of Intervals of Hope, it's to reunite the family. And in the case of Poor Man's Galapagos, it's a son struggling to help a father who he sees as in distress, despite obstacles in his own life. So.
Good, good. I think the famous phrase, "I am not worthy," seems to come out a lot with fathers and sons, and it's an eternal struggle for the son to prove that he's worthy of the father, which happens in both these two books. Now, you have a lot of battle scenes in this book, both from World War I and World War II. How did you verify them for authenticity?
Okay, so those were derived from firsthand experiences of people who were there. So as I mentioned, Gordon, as well as my great-grandfather from his letters. So, and I also went back to fiction. So I read a lot of nonfiction when I was researching the book, but I also read a lot of fiction. So some of the fiction that I read was Timothy Finley's The Wars. So that was the effects World War I had on an empathetic main character. And just an interesting story about that is I had a publisher say that Intervals of Hope shouldn't be published because The Wars was done so well. And I said, I really disagreed with his comments, because if that was the case, then all writers should put down their pens based on what was done before. So Joseph Boyden's 3-Day Road. So Joseph drew upon family stories from his grandfather and his uncle, who were soldiers in World War I, for that book. There's Ken Follett's Fall of Giants and Winter of the World. So those were sprawling epics focused on an assortment of characters in World War I and World War II. Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls, with Robert Jordan as an explosives expert in the Spanish Civil War, with some excellent secondary characters. There's a couple of comical ones, which were Catch-22 by Joseph Heller and Roddy Doyle's A Star Called Henry. And Stephen Crane's Red Badge of Courage, All Quiet on the Western Front. And there's a book on Canadians who deserted during World War I, which is more of a nonfiction, but which I found interesting. So what really gave the authenticity was the experiences detailed in the letters from the Great War and the interviews I had with Gordon. So Gordon shared his experiences that fed into the battle scenes, but they also fed into Nicholas's experiences in London between the wars. So I also explored Gordon's relationship with his father, and that provided some of the details that were utilized in the novel as well. So the short answer is extensive reading in fiction and research in nonfiction was augmented by firsthand experience. So that is what provides the book with authenticity.
Good, Chris. That's very detailed and a lot of hard work put in there. Now we're going to take a slight break from all these questions that I've been asking you, and I'm going to ask you to read. But before that, I'd also like to ask our viewers, if they have questions, please type them into the comment section of the Facebook feed. And as soon as Chris is finished with his reading, we'll pass them on to him, and hopefully he can answer them for you. So go ahead, Chris, read us something and set us up for this book.
Sure, thank you. Okay, so as a lead into this scene, this is a scene at the beginning of the novel. So Nicholas Dixon lives with his mother and brother in London, England between the wars. So his father, Wilfrid, was once with the 1st Battalion, 1st Canadian Regiment in the trenches of the Great War and now works in the coal mines of South Leeds, and he rarely returns to his family. So the main character, Nicholas, is age 14. He's the eldest of 2 boys. And in this scene, he's listening in on an argument between his parents. And he's muttering comments to himself based on what he's hearing. So his parents are in the kitchen and Nicholas is in the adjoining room in the dark. And he's leaning against the wall, just listening in, and he can see his parents' reflection in a window. So. I could not recall the last time I had seen my mother smile, but there must have been a period when she smiled often, a time when that was all my father thought about. After meeting her and her father, a retired lieutenant at the bar of the Cecil Hotel during the war, Paul must have fought with her image in his mind. Her visage had surely changed little since then, her waved auburn hair cropped short and her lips curling toward the dimples drawn on her cheeks when she smiled. In his idle moments in the trenches, Paul must have deliberated about his homecoming and their life together after the war, having some conception of a life he was fighting for, his image of their future, nothing like this. The reflection of Pa simply stared across the table, his image cloudy with the steam rising above the pot. "You're keeping the family apart," she said, "not me." "You're both to blame," I said, far too loud. "No giving in. More his fault than hers, though." The jig was up. Pa walked into the next room. Finding me leaning against the wall, he jumped. "Go upstairs," he said. I stood there as Mum lit some lamps to illuminate the white and gold drawing room. She sat down in her rocker and began knitting a blue sweater. The fireplace glowed with blue and white decorative tiles and an iron hood, the wavering illumination adding to the light from a tasseled table lamp. Black fur shone from the cat Minalouche, now sleeping on the floor beside her. "I'm not so tired," I said, casually moving away from the wall, peering into his eyes. "But maybe, based on the look of you, I should be. Why are you home?" "Brasher than ever, I see," he replied. "What did you overhear?" "You said you're not here to stay, then you said something about luggage, I guess, which is confusing if you're not moving back here. Then you said you missed us. You have a promotion. You're looking for a new row house in South Leeds where we can live together as a family. So after all that, I'm to blame for keeping the family apart? Mom doesn't want to be in South Leeds. You don't want to be here. So when you were in the war, what were you fighting for?" He paused before answering, squinting at me and shaking his head. "What claptrap are you on about? I mean, why aren't you living here? Don't you want us?" There was no response until, clenching his right fist in his left hand, he raised his arms and shoved me back. Losing my grip on the floor, my contorted body spilled down and he slinked through the front door without a word. Minalouche darted after him. Mum threw her knitting needles to the side, the drumsticks clattering to rest. She embraced me there on the wooden floor, squeezing out tears. He would not be back for months this time, maybe longer. I wanted to run after him, but I had not challenged his departures before, and I certainly wasn't going to oppose him further, a soldier who, without contemplating desertion, had risked his life so often over a 4-year duration of service to his country. Yet running away seemed so easy to him now. I'll stop there.
Yeah, good. Thank you, Chris. That was a very dramatic opening. I think that was the first chapter in your book, right?
Yes, that's right.
So we have some questions coming in now, and I have my own still, but let me switch to a question from the audience. One of the questions is, what do you hope people will take away from this book?
Okay, so I think what people will take away from it, what I hope they will take away from it, is the expectation of hope, so that looking at all of the elements that that weave through the novel, there's the thread of hope. So I would expect that they would take away a feeling of hope and positive experience from the novel. And also, I'll add that it's very thoroughly researched. So I would expect they would take away some interesting historical details that maybe they didn't know about before. Things like the British Union of Fascists, where it was the rise of fascism in Britain that, it's generally not written about. It's something that I didn't know a lot about before I started doing the research. So that's the answer to that question.
Okay, I have another one here. What character do you identify with the most?
Okay. I would identify most with the main character, Nicholas. So he's a younger young man at the beginning of the novel, age 14. And at that age, he's looking at, okay, what's my next step in life? So he's looking at, not looking at school because he's done his schooling. He had the option to stay until he was 18 in school, but did not choose to take that. So he's trying to think where he's going to work, what he's going to do, how he's going to reunite the family. So he's trying to fix a lot of things and trying to figure out things in his own life. So I would say I relate most to Nicholas in that trying to figure things out in your own life is a powerful force when you're a young man, trying to do that. So.
I have another question, which is actually quite I think a tough one, but
Okay.
you should ask the tough questions. Why did you choose an adolescent protagonist? The questioner goes on to say, I do understand that you said you were exploring the father-son situation, but you does suggest a power imbalance.
Okay, I didn't get the entire question. Why did I choose a what protagonist?
An adolescent protagonist.
Innocent?
Adolescent. He's a teenager.
Oh, okay, adolescent, I see. So yeah, in doing that, I think that it really, at the beginning of the novel, again, his father's living away, so he's got a disjointed family. And that's not something that was common back in 1930s, that you would have a divorced family or, family living apart. And that's part of the struggle that being a younger child, I think, is really hits home with him. It's not something he can easily dismiss. It's something that really drives him and motivates him and really creates the struggles that carry him through the novel. My point is that being a younger man, he's, it's influencing him more than it would be, say, if he was in his 30s. He's not going to be as driven to do that. So.
Okay, and in fact, the questions are pouring in, but I'm going to ask you a few of mine because hopefully that will provide the readers with a sense of what this book is all about, a greater sense of what the book is all about, and then they might prompt further questions. So let me go on to this one, which I have been pondering for a while. One often forgets the fact that there are long periods of waiting in between combat. And you capture this very well with your protagonist, Nicholas, who is itching to get into the action, but having to endure much waiting in between the combat situations. Is there a danger of losing the reader due to the lack of action while you try to show this other reality of war?
Yeah, I can certainly see that potential. So, but with any novel, there's highs and lows of tension. There's intervals where in waiting, you're looking forward to the next challenge, what the next obstacle is, and trying to better your circumstances along the way. So as you pointed out, that waiting is a reality of war. And I first saw that when reading through the letters and from the Great War, where my great-grandfather was enduring constant training and waiting to get to the front, wanting to get there. And in the Second World War, there's a lot of occupied countries in Europe with fighting by underground resistance groups and raids. And I saw that through the interviews with Gordon, that caused some of his waiting. But I think in showing the waiting, there's anticipation, there's expectation of something else that really connects all of the events in the novel, and that's the reason for the title as well.
Okay, let me ask you a controversial one. Many young men leave families behind to sign up for wars of liberation overseas. Nicholas is one of them. Yet history judges some of these youth as heroes. For example, the Vietnam War and the Spanish Civil War. A lot of young men went from North America over there to fight. But others who also went from here to there to fight, like the ones who went to fight for the ISIS caliphate, were considered villains. So who decides what is just and what is unjust?
Yeah, so God is the ultimate authority on what's just and unjust, but from the judgment of history, those who signed up to go overseas in World War I and World War II and risk their lives for the freedoms that we've enjoyed our whole lives, those are indisputable heroes in my mind. So.
Okay, well, that's a good answer. Thank you. I'm going to take a question now from the audience. What was the most difficult part of your research?
Well, I would say that the most difficult part was like when I was interviewing Gordon, I think he had a reticence at the beginning to disclosing some details about his experiences in the war. And I've communicated with him recently, and he's hopefully he's in the launch tonight. So if you're in, hi, Gordon. So, so he had some reticence in the beginning to disclosing some of these details, and he's since been able to open up. Like in the interviews, he was able to open up to me, and he said that since then he's been able to open up more to his family. I saw an interview with him on television as well recently. So I think that that was a difficult part, was trying to get him to relay details that he wasn't really ready to reveal. So it took some time, and it was a difficult process at the beginning, but it turned into some wonderful conversations and just a wonderful relationship with him.
Good. One more from the audience. How did you transition from the diary and letters and research to writing the story?
Oh, okay. So I had kind of written the story along with Poor Man's Galapagos, and the story didn't really work the way it was, because I had the father was an aircraft pilot that had been in the Great War, and his big feat was running into a Zeppelin and downing the Zeppelin over London. So that was why he was the hero figure, but I didn't have a lot of good background on that, and didn't have a lot of good research. I tried to research it. It just really wasn't working. So I think when going through the letters and everything, I was able to kind of pull out the details of what the effects might be on that main character. So getting those letters was very important to kind of give the father an identity, right? So then another important factor was having those interviews with Gordon with World War II, in order to say that, okay, this individual that I'm interviewing is basically the main character of the novel, which is something that a lot of novelists can't interview their main character, which was something that was interesting. So when I saw the article in the newspaper, I was just very excited to talk to Gordon, just based on that he was, the main character in the novel and what I had conceived of as the main character. So.
Good. So I have another question for you on the actual craft and the writing of the book. You went through many drafts to complete this novel over several years. I know, because I was involved in some of those drafts, and we went back and forth a lot.
Yeah.
What was that process like, and how did the book change from its original conception?
Okay, so yeah, that's a good question. And it's also described on the website for the book, which is intervalsofhope.com. So I mentioned Poor Man's Galapagos earlier, and Intervals of Hope, Poor Man's Galapagos were originally conceived as a single novel, which is this is the Poor Man's Galapagos, so and Intervals of Hope here. So if you combine those two novels, it becomes something substantial for your bookshelf, right? So in looking at those with the Humber School for Writers, my writing mentor was David Adams Richards, and he suggested splitting the manuscript into two novels. So at the time, I didn't want to do that, but it makes sense now because it was far too long for a single novel, as you can attest to, Shane, I'm sure. So, so the website calls Poor Man's Galapagos a sort of sequel to Intervals of Hope because it explores some of the same themes. It's like a companion volume in a South American setting. So if you read Poor Man's Galapagos after Intervals of Hope, then you can see patterns emerging, commonalities, similarities between the two novels in theme and in character. So, but the book really didn't work until after I received the letters and the interviews with Gordon, and I was able to give the book an authenticity and a life that it didn't have before. So I'm grateful to Gordon and to my Uncle Darren for those gifts. So, and Poor Man's Galapagos and Intervals of Hope, they're both very good reads in my opinion. So.
No, they are. And I'm glad you did break them up into two different books, because even though the theme of the father and son conflict is prevalent in both books, the setting and, Ecuador versus Europe in the war gave it the flavor of two separate stories. And it made for easier reading because you were not running all over the world trying to solve this problem, right? So I'm glad you did. So I have one final question. And then we can do another reading if you like. What are you working on now?
Okay, so I'm working on a couple of novels. The first one, I'm in the process of marketing it. So it's literary fiction like the others. And from the description of the novel, it's an exploration of European art through literary and scientific perspectives. It's a portrait of marriages in disarray and an unforgettable tale of betrayal, grief, forgiveness, and the devastating effects of obsession. So MG Vasanji was my writing mentor for that. And Antianis Salika was once the artistic director for the Humber School for Writers. He sent me his book, Woman in Bronze, and suggested that I read Martin Sloan as well by Michael Redhill. So I did that. And some portions of that novel are already published. So one excerpt from the novel was published in Descant magazine. And there's also an excerpt that was shortlisted in the Matrix Lit Pop Awards for Fiction, which is Matrix is out of Montreal. And so I'm also working on another novel, which takes place in Toronto in the Cobourg area, as well as Belleville. And it's a historical novel which involved quite a bit of research again at the Toronto Library Archive. So that was a great resource for that. So.
Okay, and I have one more question from the audience. This might be the make or break question.
Oh.
What does your book offer in such an admittedly saturated genre?
Oh, okay. So what does it offer is it offers like a little told story. So between the world wars, you'll find there are some novels out there. There's like crime novels. And those were published recently within the last decade. And there's other ones that are more mass market type of books, like Winter of the World, like those Ken Follett books I mentioned. And so there's books like that. But not a lot of books are set in between the wars, where the focus is, okay, World War One, where you have the father that fought in World War One, and in World War II, you have the son fighting in that war. So that's something that I wanted to explore was, okay, what was life like between the world wars? So as a starting point for the novel. And if you look at that, there are books like A London Family Between the Wars, it's called, by M. Vivian Hughes. And that's more of a memoir, but it describes like she moves into this town, a rural town, and she's, being forced to get into the knitting circle in her town. Otherwise, she'd be ostracized. It's things like that. So it's a memoir, and she had like a little bit of a brash personality for some of the people that were in this town. So it's interesting, but it's a memoir. And so I didn't find a lot of interesting literary fiction that was set in London between the wars. And I really found that as an interesting setting. And the premise being with the father-son in the two different wars. And so that's kind of what I see as what this novel has to offer. And there's a lot of research, again, that went into it that that gives it an authentic feel.
No, and if I can add something to that question, I think there's a lot here in the sense that you have the situation in World War One and how veterans were treated at that time versus the situation in World War II and how the veterans were treated. Not much different, but there was a slight difference. The technology of war was different. And then the trade union movements, the black shirts in England, the collieries and the conditions of work in those places, pretty horrible places to work in and to live in. And then the push to come to Canada, which sent a lot of these British immigrants over to Canada. And then yet the homing call to say, I've got to go back and serve my country, even though I've now come to Canada and I'm considered to be safe. And that homing call and then the cost that comes with it. So I think there's a lot more than just a war story and a story of battles, which there is also in this book. So I think there's a lot going on in this book, and I'm glad you did break it up into two books again, between Home and Galapagos and this one. So having said that, why don't you read us one more section? And if there are other questions from the audience, please put them into Facebook and we'll be happy to ask Christopher after he finishes the second reading. So go ahead, Chris.
Okay. So in this second reading, Nicholas and his father Wilfrid attend a rally in June 1934 just to see what's happening in their country. In historical perspective, at the time of the rally, Sir Oswald Mosley had founded the British Union of Fascists, which was supporting Hitler and Mussolini, that often held rallies and demonstrations in the Jewish areas of London. So just to be deliberately provocative. And then at the time of this rally, the British Union of Fascists had around 50,000 members, is what they alleged. And they were holding rallies with the support of the newspaper, the Daily Mail, and support from Germany and Italy. And the unemployment in Britain the year before was almost 23%, and there was rampant homelessness in London. So at that time in Germany, President Hindenburg had appointed Hitler as chancellor, and labor union and the Nazi party were banned. And Hitler hadn't begun assassinating his political enemies yet in the Night of the Long Knives, but that was to follow. And then in Italy, thousands of armed fascists had entered Rome, and the king asked Mussolini to form a new government. So Mussolini became the prime minister, asserted his right to supreme power, and declared himself the dictator of Italy. So 2/3 of the press was fascist owned. The other political party members were imprisoned without trial. So fascism was on the rise throughout the world, and Nicholas and his father Wilfrid are attending this British Union of Fascists rally in England to see what's happening in their country and why. We didn't gab about our father at school these days. If we did, though, I would have explained that Wilfrid Dixon was living in a hole full of coal dust, groaning conveyors, and sweaty solitude that kept him isolated from some of the business of the country, its political uprising, and the self-proclaimed leaders of tomorrow. A confinement that must have kept him unaware of the Oxford meeting in 1933, a meeting I had read about in the local paper where fascist black shirts were accused of throwing hecklers downstairs and beating their heads off stone floors. It likely did not echo word of the weapons the Gloucestershire Echo alleged were at the black shirts' headquarters. The chair and table legs covered in barbed wire and 6-inch nail spikes, the potatoes entrenched with razor blades, the knives, the knuckle dusters, the koshas, and the stocking stuffed with broken glass. The limited news probably did not deliver Lord Rothermere's Daily Mail headline proclaiming, "Hurrah for the black shirts," or the series of articles that followed under that same title. It was a restriction that confined him during the meetings and the subsequent Albert Hall speech delivered near Knightsbridge to an estimated 8,000 people on a March evening in 1934. In the long story of the human race, races have struggled up to nations and nations up to mighty empires and scaled the heights of history. Lit by the flame of such insurrection, that moment rises from the very soul of England, that give all, that dare all, that England may live in greatness and in glory. But he had to eventually depart from his quarantine, and on the night of the Olympia rally on June 7th of that same year, he took me to the streets of London and Hyde Park, where at Speaker's Corner, we first saw a black shirt, an elderly man dressed from head to toe in the color of midnight with a lightning emblem on his sleeve. Standing on a brown soapbox on the sidewalk by a low gray metal fence as other black shirts distributed pamphlets to the crowd around him, he addressed a question about the violent demonstrations reported in the papers. "We have to defend ourselves," the man said, slurring his speech, probably drunk. "They don't want us to speak because they know we're right. Those rabble-rousers will do anything to prevent us talking." He explained to the alternating cheering and derision of the crowd that they had the right to be there, that they had earned the freedom to convene and discuss the issues of the day through the riots of '66, and that they should all follow him to the Olympia rally where thousands more were gathered. Britain's glorious and great head held high, a nation with cheerful, untroubled people. Now that sounded like something worth fighting for. We were anxious to follow this man anywhere, and the crowd began to push along the road with the current of a river. Past Marble Arch, a light rain began to fall. We were on a boat in a rainstorm, being carried away with the weight of the water. Men standing nearby shouted insults and hissed at us as we shuffled through a stadium entrance. We covered ourselves against the onlookers in the rain, drifting into the shelter of the shore, and I yelled the same insults back without knowing what half of them were. I had read of the opposition and did not know whether those in the blur of people shouting were communists, independent Labour Party members, or Jewish radicals. The bobbies intervened, though, keeping the men back. The law was on our side. But my indifference to the protesters only seemed to make them angrier, as did Pa's expression. His eyes cast forward, intent and defiant, as he covered his head and led me to a standing position among an enormous crowd. "I've never seen so many people all in one building all at one time," Pa said. "Why are all these men here?" I asked. "Same as us, I suppose, whatever our reason is." He smiled and looked over at me. "If you've forgotten, I don't know," I said, smiling. "Then we're off." I'll stop there.
Okay. Well, it seemed like we having some small problems on the internet connection on your side, Chris, but let's keep going. And hopefully that things will be a little stable moving forward. There's a couple more questions and I'll ask them quickly in case we lose you. Have you approached any legions and what was their response?
Yeah, so I did approach the Royal Canadian Legion, a number of branches, and had some very positive response, as well as the Royal British Legions. I had a number of good responses from them and encouragement and support. And so I have committed to donating 40% of my author proceeds to the Royal Canadian Legion and 40% to the Royal British Legion. So.
Well, I hope they're listening because that's a very noble gesture on your part. And then a related question on that is, are you doing any special marketing around Remembrance Day?
Yeah, I did a lot of marketing up to now with the legions, but no special marketing planned for tomorrow. So basically, this is having the book launch the day before is kind of the marketing tool right now. That's being...
Okay. Well, that's good. And on that note, I'd like to also point out to folks, if they can see the book, might be a bit difficult on my screen. Maybe you can hold up the book, Chris.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So that's Intervals of Hope, and it's available where all good books are sold. It can be ordered through your neighborhood bookstore. It's available online through Amazon and Indigo. It can be purchased as a Kindle through the Amazon platform and also as an EPUB on the Kobo platform. So it's available, as I said, wherever good books are sold. And I hope you'll buy a copy and support this young and enterprising and really hardworking author who's really trying very hard to get his books into the public view. So with that, and I see I have no more questions. I think everybody's been very happy with what you've been saying so far, Chris.
Okay.
So I wish you all the best with the book. I hope it does well. It deserves to do well. I want to thank you for being on our show tonight. And I also want to thank all our listeners and viewers and for the questions that they asked us tonight and for the engagement. I hope you will tune into other Blue Denim events. We have another one coming up on the 23rd of November, same time, same channel, on fate, playing out in the writing of fiction and memoir. And that has a panel of writers involved in a conversation. So hopefully you'll join us for that. And for others that we will post from time to time, the invitations or the events are posted on the Blue Denim Facebook page. So with that, I wish you all the best and happy remembrances of Remembrance Day tomorrow. Hopefully, we can pay honor to our heroes who gave us the chance to enjoy the lifestyle we have today. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Good night.
Shane, I would also like to thank Blue Denim Press, and I would like to thank you for hosting the event and putting up with all my rewrites over the past several years. So, and I would like to thank everyone for their support of the novel, and I'd like to thank Gordon Schottlander and to other veterans who are listening in today. I thank you for fighting for the freedoms that we've enjoyed our entire lives.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.